If you've not yet upgraded to a standing desk, then you have been missing out. Luckily, this video's sponsor, Eureka Ergonomic, offers the best standing desk for gamers and work from home professionals. Both Austin and myself have been happily using their Aero standing desk for nearly 2 years now, and we can see why IGN rated it the single best standing desk for gamers. Click the link below to learn more about it, or stick around to the end of the video to learn more. Is Death Stranding 2 a good video game? Yes, of course it is, absolutely. I think anyone who says otherwise isn't fully acknowledging how much imagination, creativity, technical excellence, and artistry is in this package. I actually think that this is the best looking, best performing game we've ever seen on a console. I think the facial capture and cutscene direction here is in a league of its own. I think its soundtrack is an absolutely inspired set list of original tracks and the best new music Kojima has saved onto his iPod. Principally, I think the sandbox that Kojima and his team have designed here is pretty extraordinary, giving the player a huge amount of choice in traversal, combat, and stealth. So much choice, in fact, that it allows you, not Kojima, to define what sort of experience you want to have. If you want this to be arduous and laborious, then crank the difficulty, play offline, don't utilize more advanced tools at your disposal, and roleplay the Porter experience as you imagine it. Conversely, if a relaxed and fun experience is what you're chasing, one that allows you to playfully experiment with all the tools that Kojima has given you here, then play on normal difficulty, connect to the online mode, fabricate a truck and pack it full to bursting with gadgets and weapons, enjoy a leisurely cruise along the highways, or straight up steep mountain inclines in a truck that'll collect cargo for you, stopping only to wipe out the occasional bandit camp with your machine gun that conveniently shoots non-lethal rounds, eliminating the bothersome need to dispose of corpses. All this choice being in the player's hands has seemed to fix what many saw as broken in Death Stranding 1. It was a pretty stark, weird, arduous game that met a hostile critical reception and a fairly mixed reception from players. In contrast, Death Stranding 2 has met near universal acclaim. It's one of the highest rated games of the year, and the overall chatter about it is just so different this time around. There's just so much immediate affection for what it's doing, and that's a broadly held view rather than being the purview of just the Kojima stans. But here's my view. I have never found that particular flavor of player choice appealing. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying that it's not what I personally enjoy. Sandbox style experiences that ask me to calibrate the difficulty and that ask me to find the fun by imagining scenarios and then executing them, that's just not appealing to me, personally. I like watching clips of that stuff on TikTok, but when it comes to actually playing something, I like it when a developer builds me a puzzle box and then I have to solve it. I like when they give me lots of different tools to do that with, allowing me to choose how I solve that puzzle, but I still need that puzzle. I need the constraints, and I need things to overcome, because when I don't have those things, I get bored and I lack the feeling of accomplishment. Death Stranding 1 was that puzzle box. Its environment and mission design forced you to contend with its core traversal systems and to make creative use of the various tools you unlock along your way. Combat with human enemies was possible, but fraught, necessitating a thoughtful approach, one that had real consequences if you accidentally killed an enemy. Combat with non-boss BTs was basically impossible, which forced really tense, anxiety-inducing stealth scenarios. The contrast with Death Stranding 2 couldn't be starker. Here, no mission design ever asks anything truly challenging of me, because the friction inherent in the core traversal systems has been totally smoothed out, and the potency of things like vehicles and the coffin skateboard completely neutered the challenge the environment might pose. Combat with human enemies is very frequent, and unless you specifically challenge yourself to play in a specific way, combat is also entirely mindless, devoid of any challenge owing to your overpowered gear and the underpowered enemy AI. As for BTs, they're basically not in the game anymore, and when they are, you can just KO them with your blood boomerang. The tension and horror that these enemies brought to the original Death Stranding is almost entirely absent here. What makes all this particularly frustrating for me is that for each of the things I just listed, Kojima has made these fig leaf additions which gesture towards depth or evolution, but deliver no actual substance. A new setting in Australia promises a more diverse landscape, but it's still just a lot of rocky plains and a snowy mountain at the end. Early game missions involving a bushfire, an earthquake, and a sandstorm imply the presence of a complex weather system that just completely evaporates after the game's opening hours. Human enemies now sport more advanced technology like magnetic shields, but that just means you need to shoot them a few more times before they die. And newly added BT enemies that can see you might have been terrifying if you couldn't now just shoot them with the same assault rifle you can use to shoot human enemies. Worst of all, they took the piss grenades out of the game, and look, I love you Kojima, I always will, but I really do draw the line at the piss grenades. Separate from these gameplay elements, I think there are some big problems with the storytelling here. Writing has never been Kojima's strong suit. He's a great visionary, creative director, Imagineer, but his actual storytelling and writing has always been fairly average to bad, including in Death Stranding 1. The difference there, though, was that the world building could supplement that storytelling. Every new cutscene was a chance to learn more about this obscure world that Kojima had imagined for us. but with that world building done and little to advance it here, the script and our attention are naturally more focused on the actual story and the characters and the dialogue, and they're just not great on their own merits, but also because Kojima has bitten off well and truly more than he can chew, tackling some incredibly dark themes that I don't think he's deft enough to properly handle. I've already heard it said that you cannot judge Death Stranding 2 in the context of Death Stranding 1 because they're very different games. It's like Alien to Aliens, and I actually do think that's a somewhat helpful comparison, but it's not entirely accurate. That would be more like Resident Evil 3 to Resident Evil 4, same IP trying to accomplish completely different things. Here, there's a lot of overlap between what Death Stranding 1 and 2 are trying to accomplish, and it's that overlap that I don't like because it makes everything feel so compromised in a way that the first game just wasn't. Like, if you're gonna let me use a truck this much, then you need to add the ability for me to get a flat tire or something just to keep it interesting. If you're gonna make Death Stranding 2 an action game, then you're gonna have to invent more interesting combat scenarios than just stand there and shoot the boss while they shoot back. If you want us to engage in combat with BTs, then you actually need to invent a BT that can fight back. And if you're going to tell this incredibly dark, traumatic story about loss and grief, I think you need to calibrate the rest of the game's tone so that all of that feels real rather than just a plot twist waiting to happen. Death Stranding 1 was a brilliant video game that meant a lot to me because of its perfect fusion of gameplay and narrative themes. We and Sam were one in our struggle to unite the continent. We felt every footfall, every new ridgeline summited was its own achievement, every new zipline constructed a game-changing foothold in our odyssey. Here in Death Stranding 2, we just glide over the top of everything on our skateboard. That is more fun. Death Stranding 2 is more fun than Death Stranding 1, and I think that's why it's resonating so much with so many people. But I didn't come to Death Stranding for fun. I came for that other thing, and I just don't think it's here anymore. And while that makes Death Stranding 2 a really great video game in many aspects, and I admire it, it's also one that I just enjoyed a lot less than the first one.
Guess it's time we thought about moving. Maybe further south.
Sam the man. In the dark. About everything.
So you'll do it?
Death Stranding 2 is a unique game in Kojima's body of work because it's a direct sequel set some 11 months after the events of the first game. It's the same-ish time period, a similar core cast of characters, a similar setting. This continuity creates a unique challenge for Kojima. Can he sit with a world that he's already built and still continue to flesh it out in interesting ways? Can he deepen his characters rather than simply introduce or reboot them? And can he tell an actual story rather than just leaning on world building delivered through expository dialogue? I think the answer to most of these questions is sort of. Kojima does manage to accomplish a fair amount here with this story. I think more than people are giving him credit for, but it's undeniably very patchy, and I think it makes clear the need for Kojima to be more collaborative in his writing process because his natural strengths as an audacious visionary and world builder are often diametrically opposed to his desire for his storytelling and dialogue to feel emotive and affecting. Death Stranding 2 continues the saga of Sam Porter Bridges. He has successfully connected the former USA by way of the chiral network, and having rescued his BB Lou, they now live happily together in seclusion. That is, of course, until Fragile, played by Leah Seydoux, rocks up and offers Sam one last job: to unite Mexico in the same way he did the US. Reluctantly, Sam agrees, but just as he's on the cusp of completing that mission, the brief changes. A portal has opened to the Australian continent, and now Sam must connect that too, so that new portals might appear, linking continents to one another through the chiral network, restoring humanity's connections after the calamitous effects of the Death Stranding. There is a central plot to Death Stranding 2, but I think it matters far less than the anthology of stories that are unfolding within this broader plot. That's partially because these anthology stories are more interesting in their own right, and it's also because the main plot is not good at all. Its main antagonist is Higgs. Again. I think bringing him back was a huge misfire since Higgs was an incredibly underbaked bad guy in the first Death Stranding, and he manages to be even more one-dimensional here. He really is motivated entirely by vengeance and cruelty and nihilism, and now he's got this whole Joker thing going on too, which in other circumstances might have been interesting, but here it only serves to make him even more of a caricature. Kojima has delivered us some fantastic villains over the years, and this guy does not come close to that bar. Kojima actually has form in rebooting characters, you know, bringing them back but giving them entirely new identities, personalities, motivations, whatever. If there was ever a villain ripe for that sort of treatment, it was Higgs. But some creepy clown makeup can only carry a character so far, and as an antagonist, Higgs is a massive letdown yet again. Just as Kojima is unable to find his footing with Higgs, I think there's a similar mishandling of Sam, but in different ways. The The starting point, though, is to recognize that there was something very inspired about Kojima's casting of Norman Reedus in the role of Sam in the original Death Stranding. I didn't really notice it when I played through the original game, but now having spent more time with Sam, he's kind of absolutely perfect for this type of game and this particular approach to a playable protagonist. Kojima has said that he wants Sam to be a semi-silent protagonist. He can speak, but he's not meant to speak all that much, because when Sam is speaking, the player is not filling Sam's shoes. It's when he's silent that we become Sam, and there's something right about Norman Reedus' ability to be silent, but still make his presence felt. He carries himself in a way where the silence comes naturally. He's not without thought or emotion, it's just that externalizing them feels like the last resort. In the first game, that was particularly perfect because there wasn't too much need for Sam to emote. He was the game's protagonist, but it didn't feel like he was the true center of it. It was about the events and the cast of characters and the gameplay loop. It's quite different here in Death Stranding 2. Sam is the center of this game in every sense, and the inciting incident that sends Sam on his journey across Australia is very much about Sam's emotions, and the things he's learning throughout his journey should elicit a really strong emotional response from him, and the stuff that Higgs has done to Sam should elicit a total, disassociative fury. And this is where Sam actually kind of doesn't work in this game, because the stuff that happens to Sam here, it's a lot, and his character writing has not evolved to move beyond the semi-silent protagonist thing, so all of his reactions to all of these events feel so stiff and anemic. I can't go into it without spoilers, but there's a number of events in this game that happen that could and should really fuck Sam up, or that could bring out in him something we've never seen before. And sure, we might get one scene of Sam struggling with some event or realization, but in the very next scene, he just goes straight back to being the stoic statue of a man that he always is. And it's not like he's being strong and, quietly nurturing all this pain and trauma for it to bubble up suddenly at inappropriate moments. It's literally just not there. And I know it's possible to point to this moment where Sam said or did this thing, but the bottom line is this. I think this would have been a far more powerful and affecting story had it been centered on a character that could properly emotionally regulate as he processed the events happening to him and transpiring around him. I actually think that's a bit of a theme across Death Stranding 2, using trauma as a plot device without really reckoning with its aftermath. Every single main character you meet in this game has this horrific, traumatic backstory that makes total sense in a post-apocalyptic world, but the characters don't seem to really carry that trauma with them as you journey alongside them. It's all totally parked in favor of very sunny dispositions. Tarman and Dollman are two perfect examples. They sort of have the same traumatic backstory in a way, and yet you wouldn't really know it as you speak to them. They seem perfectly fine and well-adjusted and not at all melancholic. Hell, Dollman will give you a dance number if you play the right song for him, and he, most of all, is the most bottomless well of encouragement and positivity and optimism that you could ever imagine, despite having probably the most traumatic backstory that should have probably left him riddled with crippling guilt and shame. But yeah, he's positively cheery all the time. Kojima is undeniably at his strongest when he's inventing cool, ridiculous, superpowered or underpowered characters. What if there was a dude who died every 3 minutes so he could map the afterlife? That's fucking cool. What if there was a spirit medium who accidentally got stuck in the body of a doll? That's fucking cool. What if there was a guy who mastered transdimensional travel by sailing a big Metal Gear Rex looking boat through the tar currents? Sure, absolutely. That stuff is all undeniably cool as hell, and in fact the backstory cutscenes for each of these characters are arguably the best moments in the entire game, because they let Kojima pursue his cinematic ambition. He is, in large part, a cinematographer, I think. He has an eye for the aesthetics of cinema, but when he has to imbue his characters with more life and depth than just a cool conceit and a tragic backstory, he really struggles. I also think that the darkness of these various backstories and events makes this game feel very tonally incongruent. Again, I don't want to get into specifics because I don't want to spoil things, but if you're going to go to the places that Kojima wants to go to, I think you need to calibrate the rest of the experience so those things fit rather than feeling at best out of place or at worst lazy tack-ons. Again, no spoilers, so don't worry, but I think about this game's finale, and it's an incredible finale, and I loved it. But if you were to ever stop to consider what this final clash is really all about, and the horrific events that preceded it, and the feelings that Sam might be nurturing in that moment, it all just feels a little silly. And look, I know the silliness is the point, the contrast of the emotion and spectacle, of pain and joy, of the serious and unserious, the rock opera-ness of it, I get it, I truly do. But I think at some point you need to pick a lane. Either you're using pain and trauma as something serious and real, or you're just jingling them about like a set of keys. I think Kojima is jingling the keys a little too much in Death Stranding 2. I don't think any of this is revelatory insight, by the way. I think most Kojima fans will admit that while his imagination and world building is brilliant, his writing isn't. It's a shortcoming that he's often been able to sidestep owing to how often his previous games have changed casts and settings and time periods. There's a lot of new world building to be done in those scenarios, and so his games could lean on expository dialogue and new character introductions. But here, with so much of the world already established, and so many of the characters already introduced, Kojima is pushed into uncomfortable territory, the territory where characters need to find new arcs, and where the story has to be about more than just the world. In this way, I think Kojima would really benefit from having a writing partner, someone who could take all of his incredible imagination and vision and then turn it into a script that actually works. Because I think there's actually a huge amount here that is very compelling and interesting and thought-provoking. I love this cast of characters. I think their backstories are fascinating, and I would have loved to have seen those stories play out over more than just a single cutscene. The mysterious flashback sequences starring the not Metal Gear Solid dude, they are excellent. The mystery of that is so compelling and it's got a fantastic resolution, but the delivery of it is so poorly paced, with 95% of it being breadcrumbs that you can't even sift through until all of the actual substance is dumped out in the game's final cutscenes. Similar things can be said of Sam's relationship to his daughter, Lou, and to Fragile, where a lot of dramatic potential is squandered throughout the game's runtime so it could all be saved up for the game's big climax. And there's a particular moment in the finale that really comes out of nowhere, and man, it's meant to be this big emotional high point, but because it hasn't been at all hinted to or presaged prior to it happening, it just feels incredibly out of place and really silly. Hideo Kojima has often mused about how many games he has left in him, since as game dev cycles are now very long and he's 60 years old, who knows how many more games he gets the chance to make. Despite his age and accomplishments, he strikes me as a man who remains extremely creatively hungry. I think you can feel that in the way he speaks about other artists. There's not only an admiration for what they do, but an implicit desire to want to incorporate their talents into his own work, either by adopting their approaches into his own creative framework or recruiting them as collaborators. He has long ago successfully adopted the language of cinema in his game making, and his cutscene direction here is his best work to date. In fact, I think this is some of the best cutscene direction in any video game, full stop. Kojima can't make music, but I think he has mastered what it means to collaborate with musicians, and the track list he's curated here is so special, and the original music from Ludwig Forssell is absolutely inspired. Not only that, but the way all of this music is used at different times and in different ways, it's incredible. It's even more impactful here than it was in the first game, and that's really saying something. The biggest gap in Kojima's work at this point is his writing, and I hope that just as he's built connections to musicians and actors and movie directors, I hope he'll find someone with whom he can collaborate when writing, someone who can translate his boundless imagination into something more compelling and cogent than what Kojima alone is capable of doing, because Death Stranding 2 really needed that connection above all others. Death Stranding 2 is set in both Mexico and Australia, and it is absolutely fucking unbelievable to look at. I remember being at Kojima Productions a few months ago and seeing the game's intro sequence for the first time, and I was like, I can't believe this is real. I've seen people sort of dismiss this, like, oh, who cares? It's just a mountain and some sky. But like, mountains and sky, if you really take them in, something happens to you. As human beings, we are programmed to look at a horizon and feel something. It's hardwired into our DNA as a species, and Death Stranding 2, more than any other video game ever made, captures the essence of a horizon. The way that nature is rendered in this game is second to none. Obviously, Kojima understood that that connection to natural landscapes would be integral to an experience like Death Stranding, and his team truly went above and beyond. But Kojima also understood that this is a story about people, and for his storytelling to have its best shot at success, he needs his characters to look believable, to look real. No game in the history of video games has ever had characters look more detailed or more real. There's this clip doing the rounds on socials at the moment. It's of Leia Sadu doing the whole, like, you know, photo posing thing with the other girls. And yeah, it's classic Kojima fan service, sure. But the response from most people spamming it out hasn't been like horny thirsting. It's just been this awe that video games can render characters with this much detail. This is still clearly a video game render, but there's no uncanny valley here anymore. It's been completely removed. And so future technology might provide even more detail and highlight even more imperfections or blemishes or whatever, but that almost doesn't matter now because we've climbed out of the trough that is the uncanny valley, and all we see here is a human being, a digitally rendered one, but a human being nonetheless. It's a shame that this technology is often wasted on some very rough dialogue, but there is one part of the game where this technology and the storytelling are in complete unison, and it's the sequences involving the mysterious bandana man. I can't spoil those sequences, sadly, but something happens in those scenes that doesn't happen in the rest of the game. There are things left unsaid between characters, and their eyes do all the talking. and those scenes are so much more powerful and so much more affecting because of how incredible this facial technology is. But the technological wonders don't stop there. In my preview, I said the game contained the single best looking sequence I've ever seen on a console. You've no doubt seen it at this point, but this is it. Seeing a compressed YouTube video of it doesn't do it justice. Until you see this running on your own hardware, you can't get a sense of just how good this looks. And it is insane that the base PS5 can do this. Obviously, the Decima engine is a modern marvel, no doubt about that, but an engine is only as good as the people working with it. And clearly, Kojima Productions developers are maxed out, black belt, new game plus level tech wizards or some shit. I don't know, they're crazy. Obviously, visuals do not a good game make, but there's also something to be said about presentation of this caliber. Like, this is not normal. This is the sort of shit that makes us look back on stuff from a few years ago and say, damn, look how far we've come. It's one of those radical shoves that moves the industry forward, and I don't think Kojima Productions' technical excellence gets nearly the credit it deserves because it is legitimately best in class in a number of categories. Just as some of the impact of that facial technology is wasted on some very wooden dialogue, I think some of the impact of the environmental visual technology is wasted on a landscape that is far less affecting than that of the first game, and far less interesting in the way that it actually plays. A new setting was one of the big things I was most excited about when I stepped into Death Stranding 2, because Australia is a very different landscape from the US, and separate from that, I was imagining how Kojima might use that landscape to deepen the traversal puzzle that was central to the Death Stranding experience. Sadly, neither of those things really came to pass. The Australia of Death Stranding 2 is undeniably beautiful, and certainly richer and more visually diverse than the US of Death Stranding 1, but that original landscape had a certain magic to it that this new setting doesn't quite capture. It wasn't really the US we were traipsing through back then, of course. It was more like the Scottish Highlands crossed with the volcanic wastes of Iceland. Back then, Kojima wasn't trying to render a version of the US, he had a very specific landscape in mind that he thought would fit the game he was building, and then he just called that landscape the United States, even though it bore no resemblance to it. Here, Kojima handed his team a different brief. They were to render a version of Australia that was still in keeping with the overall design ethos of the Death Stranding universe. I think they've done a good job in that there is a deft balance of realistic versus stylized environments, but this brief he handed them naturally results in a less immersive landscape because Australia is just not as otherworldly as those volcanic wastes or those verdant green fields. To me, it reminds me of The Division 2, where Massive moved the game from the New York winter to the Washington, DC summer. Everyone agreed that DC looked better in terms of visual fidelity, but everyone also agreed that this new setting didn't have anywhere near the same impact that New York City did. Separate from the visuals, my biggest disappointment with Death Stranding 2 was how little the traversal puzzle has evolved, and I think the static nature of the environment design plays a big part in that. Biome diversity was something heavily implied in the game's opening hours. Mexico was a mix of plains and mountains and abandoned towns, and even had a densely forested area which not only looked very different, but also opened up options in the stealth sandbox. When you get to Australia though, it really is a lot of flat, wide open space with a snowy mountain at the end. I can't recall seeing another abandoned town. I can't recall any densely forested sections. All I really remember is a lot of driving over, black rocks and then driving over yellow rocks and then driving over sand and then of course driving over some snow. We'll talk more about the driving later, but I do think that those opening hours hinted at a level of biome diversity that just isn't present throughout the rest of the game. Like imagine, for example, if there was a cave biome in Death Stranding 2. We have quite a few caves here in Australia, and that would have really opened up some fascinating traversal challenges that would have felt truly fresh and really in keeping with what Death Stranding 1 was all about. Like imagine how creepy it would be to be stuck in a cave with a bunch of BTs when your headlamp runs out of battery. Didn't have to be that exact thing, of course. I'm just making the point that Kojima and his team haven't devised new environments that pose new challenges, and that's a bummer. The game's marketing would have you believe that a new weather system would provide those new challenges, and certainly I believed that when I previewed the opening chapters of the game at Kojima Productions earlier this year. Those opening hours deliver earthquakes that cause landslides, sandstorms that all but blind you, a bushfire that sees you encircled by flames, and flash floods that might suddenly make a river uncrossable depending on the circumstances. All this stuff looked really cool and promising, but it just completely vanishes after those opening hours, or if it is there, it doesn't do anything. Like there will be earthquakes fairly often, but the ground kind of just shakes for a bit and then you just go about your day. I experienced one avalanche as I completed the snow area. I saw one other sandstorm in my 50-hour playthrough and 0 other bushfires. And that was the one I was really pissed off about because bushfires are extremely common in Australia and it would make sense for them to feature regularly in Death Stranding 2, but they don't. Hell, you're even given a tar gun, which you're told is purpose-built to douse flames, and when you get this thing, you're like, oh, okay, I guess there are gonna be quite a few fires to put out in this game. I never used that tar gun again after that one bushfire because there was simply no need for it at all. Something similar could be said of the day-night cycle. I don't really think this added much other than a bit of visual diversity. I think there are certain small chiral creatures who appear only at night or something, but the fact that I don't know that for sure just demonstrates how little discernible difference there is between night and day. So if the environments are familiar in their functionality, the weather effects aren't really making the traversal puzzle more engaging, where is the core part of the gameplay model being strengthened or deepened? Well, to be honest, it's not. In fact, it's going the other way. And Death Stranding 2 is a rather disappointingly simple game when compared to the first, one that retreats from its core gameplay loops rather than embracing them. So long story short, because the map design here is so flat, you can drive a truck basically everywhere. Because the distance between your destinations are so large, you're incentivized to drive the truck everywhere. Because the materials economy is so generous, it's incredibly easy to always have a truck. And because there's no real dangers or wear and tear factors that might put the truck out of commission, you can drive the truck safely wherever you want for as long as you want. No one who has played this game will disagree with anything that I've just said because it's all 100% true. There are some other responses you might hear though. The first is that you can just choose to not drive the truck and walk everywhere, and look, that's true, sure, but it's not any more fun or interesting to do that because I'm just walking across mostly flat landscapes, and all the various upgrades I unlock as I play make it really easy to balance my cargo and maintain my run speed and automatically tie up my cargo so that even if I happen to fall over, my cargo doesn't spill all over the place. Walking doesn't make the journey more engaging because this game isn't really designed around giving you an engaging, challenging traversal challenge in the same way that the first game was. And this is the other response you'll often hear to criticisms of this game just being like Truck Simulator 2025. They say the first game was the same, that you could just ride a bike or a truck everywhere if you wanted to. Now look, maybe that's true, but that certainly wasn't my experience as I played through the first game. I vividly remember using ladders and climbing ropes throughout my playthrough, where I think I used 2 ladders in my entire playthrough of Death Stranding 2. I vividly remember using the zipline network in the mountains, whereas I used ziplines precisely 0 times here in Death Stranding 2. Is it the case that I simply failed to realize how good trucks were in the first game? Maybe, but I'm not alone in remarking that Death Stranding 2 is a lot of trucking with no real reason to go on foot, and that was not pervasive commentary when discussing Death Stranding 1. We talked about falling over. We talked about some clutch ladder that some other person had laid down for us so that we could get over a cliff line. We talked about the traversal challenge, and we don't talk about it here in Death Stranding 2 because it doesn't exist. If we take it as true that you could have trucked through the entirety of Death Stranding 1 and we just didn't know to do that, but now we do, then I still think it's incumbent on Kojima to respond to that new shared collective knowledge and design new challenges that make truck driving more engaging. Why can't I get a flat tire? Why isn't the degradation model more demanding? Why doesn't Timefall just completely melt this thing? Why isn't it completely ineffective in the snow? Why can't it be hacked by ghost mechs and rigged to blow? If you know that 80% of your player base is going to spend 80% of their playtime in a truck, then I think you have to think of ways to make that truck more exciting. I vividly remember the first mission I got sent to the mountain in Death Stranding 2. I was like, okay, it's been really easy to this point. I've trucked the whole way, but now it's about to get serious. There is no way they're going to let me use this truck on that mountain. Sure enough, I drive straight up that mountainside just as I'd driven up any other steep incline. And when I handed that mission in, I was so bummed out. I was really bummed that the game let me do that because it folded into a broader disappointment about how little I had walked around in this game. In Death Stranding 1, I felt like I conquered the landscape one step at a time. It felt so rewarding to reach my destination in that game. But here, most of the time, I don't feel anything because I just drove to get there. The number one thing that drew me to Death Stranding was the arduousness of the journey, that feeling of needing to get somewhere, but often being unsure if I might make it because I hadn't packed the right equipment, or maybe I'd fall and my cargo would be destroyed, or maybe I'd have to stealth past some BTs, but I wouldn't be careful enough and I'd get pulled under. None of that stuff happens when I can just drive there in a truck every single time, and combined with other quality of life features that make traversal easier and lower risk and kind of mindless, I think this crucial aspect of Death Stranding's appeal has been sanded back too much, and the game is significantly worse for it. So first of all, I'm not here to tell you how you should feel about combat stealth and BTs in Death Stranding 2. I'm fully aware that perhaps the most celebrated part of this game is the expanded combat sandbox, one that allows you to playfully dispose of enemies in a variety of ways using tools ranging from mounted chiral cannons to rubber pizzas. Do a quick scroll of TikTok and you will see thousands of clips of people doing shit that is genuinely fucking cool and funny and impressive. For real, I mean that. It is impressive how many tools and gadgets are in this game and how creative you can be in your application of them. That is was incredibly difficult for a developer to deliver, and while I'm sure it wasn't easy for Kojima Productions to make all of this happen, they certainly made it look easy. So full credit to them and full recognition that most people love this stuff. But consistent with the overall theme of this review, that stuff just isn't for me, and not only does Death Stranding 2 add a bunch of combat and stealth stuff that I'm not interested in, it also removes all of the constraints that made combat and stealth interesting to me in the first game. It was a major complaint from many people who played Death Stranding 1 that the combat sandbox was very limited. A little bit of stealth, some weapons here and there, a few mule camps scattered around the map, but they were more like environmental obstacles since it was never really the point to engage those camps directly. Similarly, the BT encounters were more about avoiding than fighting. People wanted agency in combat and stealth scenarios, and they felt that because Death Stranding wasn't delivering that, it was a shortcoming of the game. But I never ever saw it that way, ever. I thought it was a fascinating idea that full frontal engagement with an enemy resulting in their death could result in a game over scenario if you didn't properly dispose of their body in a timely manner. I thought it was fascinating to use human enemies and their encampments as part of the environmental puzzle rather than the objective itself. The objective of missions in Death Stranding 1 was almost never to go to a mule base. Bases were meant to punctuate the landscape as a river or cliff line or crater might. You gotta figure out how to get around or over those things on your way towards the delivery objective. Murdering an entire base of troops was not the point of the game because every single other game asked you to do that, and Death Stranding was the one game that didn't. Death Stranding 2 will regularly ask you to murder an entire base of troops. Well, that's not quite true, obviously. It'll never ask you to murder anyone, but functionally, that distinction doesn't really matter, since all of your weapons conveniently fire non-lethal rounds, so a weapon can look and feel and function like a regular rifle, but it's shooting magic bullets that will only KO an enemy rather than kill them. Oh, and if you happen to run over an enemy with your truck, that won't kill them either for some reason. I guess the truck's bumper bars are using the same magic tech that the bullets are made of. So that tension about wanting to avoid firing your overpowered automatic weapons, the tension is gone here in Death Stranding 2, and when you realize that, if you're anything like me and or Danny DeVito, you just start blasting. So we've got a new reality here, one where I have way more firepower and no consequences for using it. How then has the combat puzzle been deepened to maintain some sort of tension, to stop me from just standing out in the middle of a base and opening fire on everything I see? The answer to that question is absolutely nothing, because in every single combat encounter, without exception, you can just stand out in the middle of a base and open fire on everything you see. And I know that because that's basically exactly what I did throughout my entire playthrough, for real. There are so many things that make this mindless combat model possible. There's the auto healing that comes from blood bags, the endlessly generous ammo and weapon economy, the potency of your gear or your resilience thanks to things like exoskeletons and armored vehicles. Any one of those things could be tuned to provide some sort of challenge in a combat setting. Like, you know, add an enemy type who corrupts your blood bag so you can't instant heal. Add another type that jams your weapons so you need to rely on melee. Add another that hacks your exoskeleton so you can't move, whatever. None of that exists. There are lots of human and ghost mech enemy types in Death Stranding 2, but they all do exactly the same thing. They stand there and they shoot you, or they run up to you and they try to hit you, and you dispatch all of them in the exact same way. You shoot them with any gun you please. It literally does not matter. The enemy design here is entirely about aesthetics, and don't get me wrong, Ghost mechs look sick as hell. Yoji Shinkawa, still the best to ever do it, but that is it. They just look cool. They've got nothing else going on. The biggest issue though has to be enemy AI. Like if you're gonna have effectively one enemy type in the whole game, then it needs to be smarter than what's on offer here. These things are half a step up from target dummies, and so yeah, they make for really good fodder when you're trying to record clips for TikTok, but if you're looking for anything remotely engaging, then you just won't find it from them. Coming back to my review of Death Stranding 1, I said that criticizing combat difficulty in that game was kind of missing the point because Kojima was never trying to push you to a game over screen. Instead, he was trying to load you up with tension the same way you would load yourself up with packages ahead of your journey. The game was not about combat, it was about the threat that combat might pose to the process of delivering packages. An unwanted skirmish wasn't about you dying, it was about your packages getting damaged or destroyed. Here in Death Stranding 2 though, this game is often about combat. When you are sent into an enemy base, it is often to incapacitate everyone there, and certainly the ghost mech encounters, there's no reasoning with those guys, it's all about throwing down. So again, if you're gonna make me fight, I personally need something more than what is effectively one enemy type without any sophisticated AI. I need more than a flexible sandbox that just lets me mess around and stunt on what are effectively target dummies. Similar to the Traversal puzzle, I'm okay with an expanded sandbox that gives me more options, but I do need the puzzle to evolve so that the puzzle remains engaging and challenging. When it comes to combat, the expansion of the sandbox happened, but the evolution of the puzzle didn't. But hey, at least that's better than what they did to the BT encounters, because in Death Stranding 2, they basically took that shit out of the game. In Death Stranding 1, many people found the lack of agency when confronting BTs frustrating. They wanted to be able to engage them rather than just avoid them. Again, I did not see it that way. In fact, I think that BTs and the encounter design around them were one of the high points of Death Stranding. Here's what I wrote in my review of the first game back in 2019 when discussing how these encounters differed from what Kojima had earlier delivered in the Metal Gear Solid series. In these instances, Snake had options. He had guns. He could dupe guards, strangle them, attach them to a giant balloon and send them floating away. Here, Sam does not have those options, and the powerlessness of the player makes for some truly compelling horror. The sensation of terror you feel when you know an enemy is coming towards you, but you can't quite see it, only for it to become suspicious and begin splashing up mud with each footstep as it blindly reaches out for you. That is a feeling of terror that stays with you. That is what I said back then, and there is absolutely no way that I can say anything close to that here in Death Stranding 2, because basically none of the overall BT model remains intact. I mean, firstly, they're just not there. Like, I did a 50-hour playthrough, and I think I had to contend with BTs like twice during the main storyline. There were some side missions that sent me into BT territory, but not a lot of them. Given how tense and affecting BT encounters were in the first game, I really struggled to see why they have been so sidelined here. When there were BT encounters, the new gear at my disposal completely neutered any threat they might pose. I can just shoot them with guns now, the same guns I can shoot human enemies with. I have this blood boomerang thing as well, which is really just a more gimmicky way of doing the same job that an assault rifle could have done. And just as the combat puzzle against human enemies hasn't evolved owing to new enemy types or encounter design, it's the same against the BTs. There are new BT enemy types here, including BTs that can see me, but when I can just one-hit KO them, why do I care if they can see me? Which newly added BT has scaled to meet all of this new power that I have been given in Death Stranding 2? The answer to that question is none. So we've got drastically fewer BT encounters, and those encounters are now more about action and combat than stealth, and even though I've been given new ways to fight BTs, they haven't evolved to be able to fight back. This whole thing is so crazy to me because this horror element was so fundamental to the Death Stranding 1 experience. To me, it was as foundational as the Traversal was. In Death Stranding 1, we avoided combat with human enemies by just going around them, and we spent so much time running across the landscape and clambering up mountains. The BT encounters were a complete flipping of the script. It required us to slow down, to hold our breath and pray that we wouldn't be heard, and to fight off the panic that would set in when we made a mistake. As a pacing mechanism set against the rest of the game loop, BT encounters were essential in Death Stranding. But what's craziest is that BT encounters would have been even more essential in Death Stranding 2, owing to how powerful we have become in exploration, traversal, and combat. We are godlike on the Australian continent, and if ever there was a moment for us to be humbled and to be reminded of our mortality, to slow the game down and up the stakes, it would have been lots of really great, tense, terrifying BT encounters. But much like most of the game's other core components, this part has been sanded back in the name of convenience and power fantasy, but unlike those other components, it's been sanded back to the point of absurdity, and one of the load-bearing pillars of this imagined universe is basically non-existent, weakening gameplay diversity, overall game pacing, and undermining the game's compelling world building and lore.
We'll be right behind you, providing you with support.
Mission in progress. No anomalies detected. Welcome to safety.
When I was at Kojima Productions earlier this year, I participated in a group Q&A where Kojima was asked about Death Stranding 2's increased focus on combat. Here's what he said, quote, "Well, I'm not recommending people to fight more or anything like that, but there are so many people all over the world asking me to make another Metal Gear, so I added more options for combat. But this is a game focused mainly on deliveries. You can avoid the enemy by taking the long way around. You could drive by quickly using a vehicle or bike, but you could fight the enemies. I wanted to leave that choice up to the players. In that case, we needed to tweak the designs of the weapons so they were easier to use. When I was working on those mechanics, I was a little worried because many of the staff that worked with me on Metal Gear still work here, and we kept saying to each other, does this feel too much like Metal Gear?" End quote. When I previewed Death Stranding 2 some months ago, I really pushed back on this narrative that Death Stranding 2 was essentially just, Metal Gear Solid 5 2. I played those opening chapters and I was delivering parcels and I had encountered some BTs. This new location looked really promising, as did the new weather system. I could clearly see that there was more combat and I had more combat tools, and I could also sense that the game was easier than the first time around. But I really believe that as the game progressed, the systems I'd encountered would deepen. But I would get new tools to aid in my journey, but I would also meet new challenges that would ask me to use those tools in interesting ways. Principally, I just couldn't buy into the idea that Kojima was truly interested in infusing Death Stranding with more Metal Gear, because I think that Death Stranding was such a stark statement in response to Metal Gear. It was this guy being like, oh, you think I can only make one type of game? Well, how about this? This incredibly unique world, this wholly original traversal system, this complete inversion of the typical approach to combat, this action survival horror stuff when you encountered BTs, the social strand system and the asynchronous cooperation that engendered. What an incredible clap back to people who would dare call Kojima a hack or a one-trick pony. So seeing what that game was, I was like, there's no way this guy's going back to making Metal Gear inspired gameplay. And if he is, he'll do it with Physant, his upcoming stealth game. Surely he will keep Death Stranding, Death Stranding. It really pains me to say that I think I was totally wrong about that, and I realize now I was kind of deluding myself. I mean, there is a guy here that's just, Solid Snake 2.0. There's a mysterious cyber ninja who appears out of nowhere on the reg to help you out. The boat you're riding is basically a Metal Gear unit. The way that time slows down when you get spotted by an enemy or when you take them out is very reminiscent of Metal Gear Solid 5's combat pacing, and the overall flexibility of the sandbox, which is more about creativity and expression than actual problem solving, it all screams Metal Gear Solid 5. And look, I absolutely love Metal Gear. It's one of my favorite series of games, and I love Kojima more than any other single developer, and I am so pumped for Physant because yes, hook me up to the Kojima-made Metal Gear machine again, absolutely, 100%. But I loved Death Stranding because it wasn't Metal Gear. And while I'm not saying that Death Stranding 2 is Metal Gear by another name, I'm saying that enough Metal Gear stuff was added here for Death Stranding to lose its identity. I probably would have been fine with those additions if they hadn't come at the expense of so many of the things that made Death Stranding unique. Like, if you want me to feel more powerful in combat, then okay, but still protect the feeling of powerlessness and fear in BT encounters. If you want to add a cyber ninja, then fine, but maybe don't make the primary enemy faction a bunch of cyber mechs who visually and conceptually would perfectly fit in a Metal Gear game, but feel very awkwardly crowbarred in here. I can still feel the Death Stranding 2 that might have been.
Something akin to a phantom pain.
I can imagine a game where the environment design evolved to deliver new traversal challenges, where the weather systems would have made their presence felt, where the item design and economies were calibrated to deepen the traversal puzzle rather than just instantly solve it. Where combat gave me more options, but also a more diverse set of challenges that match my newfound power, where new BT enemies and scenario design would stop me in my tracks, reminding me that while I may be able to freely go where I please with ease, I was still small and weak and insignificant when measured against the greater forces of this universe. That is the game that I imagined, and that is the one that I would have hoped for. But Kojima made something very different here, something very good in its own right. And the purpose of this review has not been to suggest that Death Stranding 2 is not good. That is why the very first line in this video was me declaring that this is a good video game. The point I've been trying to make is that while Death Stranding 2 is more accessible and more flexible and more fun and more Metal Gear, I wasn't asking for any of those things. I was asking for more Death Stranding, and I don't think I got it here in Death Stranding 2. Really proud to feature this video's sponsor, Eureka Ergonomic, maker of the best standing desk for gamers and work from home professionals. Both Austin and I were sent a Eureka Aero standing desk roughly 2 years ago now, and every day since we've loved it, and we can totally see why IGN have crowned it the best standing desk for gamers. Its wing-shaped ergonomic design makes it easier to reach for things you need while also providing perfect viewing angles for second and third monitors. It comes in either 63-inch or 73-inch variants, but whichever size you choose, there's plenty of real estate so you never feel cramped. The build quality is S-tier, a heavy-duty metal frame that can not only support a huge amount of weight, but also ensures the desk is stable even at maximum height. Plus, it comes with all sorts of finishings and flourishes like programmable RGB, holders for mobile devices like tablets, a cup and headphone holder, a keyboard tray, and plenty of hacks for easy cable management. It comes in black, brown, or maple finish, and it's just a great upgrade to your desk situation, be that in terms of look, functionality, or just ergonomics, because yeah, being able to stand up from time to time while you're working or playing games is really important. I very strongly recommend it. So give your setup the glow up it deserves by visiting eurekaergonomic.com/skillup. Take a look at the Aero standing desk, take a look at some of the reviews. You're going to be very impressed by what you see. And after having used the Aero for some 2 years myself, I can tell you that the reviews are spot on and that this thing is indeed excellent. That's eurekaergonomic.com/skillup. Thanks to Eureka Ergonomic for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.